A single father nearly out of money spends his last dollars on a strange storage unit everyone laughs at. Behind the door there is only sand, but he decides to keep digging. What he finds beneath it changes everything and forces him to make a choice that will shape his future. Watch until the end, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. By the time Ethan Cole stood in front of the red storage door with his name printed on the receipt, he had exactly $63 left to his name. $63 in his checking account, a wallet that felt lighter every time he opened it, and a 9-year-old girl waiting at home who still believed, with the stubborn certainty only children possess, that her father could fix anything. The corridor smelled of dust and dry concrete, the air humming faintly with the tired buzz of fluorescent lights. Every step echoed too loudly, as if the building itself were listening. The door in front of him was painted a bright, once bold red that had faded unevenly over time. The lower half bleached by sun and weather, the upper scratched and scarred around the handle by years of careless hands. A crooked strip of yellow warning tape clung diagonally across it, peeling at the edges like a joke no one had bothered to clean up. Ethan pressed his palm against the cold metal and felt his own heartbeat vibrating back at him through the door, steady but too fast. And he wondered, not for the first time that day, whether he had crossed the invisible line between hope and stupidity and simply kept walking. The receipt crinkled softly in his other hand. His name, the unit number, the amount he had paid, $20 for a locked room full of something no one else wanted. He could have used that money for groceries, could have stretched it across a few careful meals, or poured it into the gas tank of his aging sedan to keep it running another week. He could have put it toward the overdue notice sitting in his glove compartment, the one he pretended not to see every time he opened it. Instead, he had raised his hand at an auction and bought a red door with a strip of yellow tape and whatever lay behind it. The metal under his palm was unyielding, indifferent, and for a moment he closed his eyes and let the weight of that decision settle into his chest. Home was a small 2-bedroom apartment with thin walls and a refrigerator that hummed louder than the television. It smelled faintly of detergent and reheated food, a place that tried its best to feel safe despite the constant undercurrent of worry. Lily's backpack was usually dropped by the door, shoes kicked off wherever gravity won. She was 9 years old and had learned, without ever being taught, how to read his face. When he smiled too carefully, she asked if he was tired. When he stared too long at a piece of mail, she suddenly remembered a drawing she wanted to show him. Ethan packed her lunches every morning, checked her homework every night, and ironed the one good shirt he owned for interviews that went nowhere. He told her stories at bedtime about fixing cars and building things, about problems that could be solved with the right tools and enough patience. She listened with wide eyes and nodded as if those stories were instructions for how the world worked. The truth was messier. 2 months earlier, he had still believed the delivery company when they promised restored hours after the reorganization. He had believed the old red sedan would survive one more winter if he treated it gently. He had believed his ex would keep sending her share of support regularly instead of disappearing into a new life that only brushed past their daughter when it felt convenient. Then the schedules changed overnight. Half his shifts vanished, and the car began to smoke every time he turned the key. His ex showed up sporadically, disrupting Lily's routines and leaving again without warning. It became just Ethan and Lily in the apartment, navigating days that required careful calculation. Which bill could be paid late? Which expense could be postponed? Which lie could be told gently enough that it sounded like reassurance? At night, when Lily was asleep and the apartment settled into its creaks and hums, Ethan sometimes let YouTube autoplay on his phone until his thoughts blurred. Videos of storage auctions played one after another, strangers lifting dusty doors, gasping over forgotten furniture and boxes of junk that somehow turned into rent money and second chances. He watched them the way other people watch lottery drawings, knowing the odds and ignoring them anyway. Most of his mind understood it was nonsense, a curated illusion of luck and editing. A smaller part, quieter but more persistent, whispered what if. That whisper grew louder the morning he noticed the flyer taped crookedly to the wall of the laundromat. Public auction. Westline storage. Saturday. He almost threw it away with the rest of the junk mail until Lily saw the picture of metal doors and asked if it was like the shows he watched. Her eyes lit up in a way he hadn't seen in weeks. He told her maybe, tried to brush it off, but the thought followed him home and sat with him through dinner and dishes. He told himself he would only go to look. He counted his savings again and again, calculating how much it would cost just to show up and see what happened. He was not reckless by nature. His life had become an exercise in restraint. Yet the idea of one bold step, however unlikely, began to feel less like fantasy and more like the only door still open. Saturday morning, he filled a thermos, kissed Lily on the head while the neighbor watched her, and drove to Westline Storage with his stomach twisted into a tight knot. The auction felt exactly like the videos, and nothing like them at all. 20 or 30 people crowded the office, a mix of regulars who greeted each other by name, a few young guys filming on their phones, a couple quietly arguing about how much they could spend. Ethan stayed near the back, hands in his pockets, the numbered card heavy and unfamiliar between his fingers. The auctioneer moved quickly, doors rolling up for 30 seconds at a time, quick glances, fast bids, locks slamming shut. The first units were full of broken furniture and waterlogged boxes. The numbers climbed in seconds, soaring past anything Ethan could consider. He told himself he was only there to observe, to learn how it worked, to leave a little wiser and not poor. Then they turned a corner and stopped in front of a door that didn't match the others. It was red, deeper and more saturated than the surrounding beige, cracked with age and crossed by a strip of yellow warning tape. The manager's voice dropped slightly as she explained that the renter had paid nearly a year in cash, arrived late one night with a small truck, loaded it, and vanished. When they finally opened it, there had been nothing inside but sand. The lock snapped open and the door rolled up, and a confused sound passed through the crowd. From where Ethan stood, it looked like an entire sandbox poured into the unit, packed tight from wall to wall, sloping upward toward the back. No boxes, no furniture, no tools, just sand. Someone had stuck a thin pole into it and wrapped it with warning tape like a flag. People laughed. Someone joked about buried treasure, someone else about a body. Ethan almost walked away, ready to follow the flow toward the next unit, but something held him in place, and the sand looked wrong, too smooth, too deliberate. There were faint scratches on the concrete near the entrance, marks that suggested something heavy had been dragged across the floor. And the red door itself refused to blend in, stubborn against the neutral background, like it was asking to be noticed. The auctioneer clapped his hands and started the bidding. 50, silence. 40, nothing. 30. A woman near the front shook her head. 20. Come on, folks, the auctioneer urged. The door alone's worth scrap. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. $20 was less than a tank of gas, less than a late fee, less than the shoes Lily would outgrow by spring. It was ridiculous. It was impulsive. It was also the only unit cheap enough that he could even play. Before he could think himself out of it, he raised his hand. 20, he heard his own voice say. The auctioneer repeated it. Anyone for 25. A regular squinted inside, shook his head. No one spoke. The count came down sharp and final, and with a few syllables and a scratched red door, Ethan's day, and maybe his life, tilted. The crowd moved on, chasing units with visible boxes and furniture, and Ethan stayed where he was, staring at the strange, silent mound that now belonged to him. Up close, the sand looked even more carefully packed, layered as if poured in stages. Near the edge of the concrete pad, half buried at the threshold, a small plastic toy truck caught his eye, bright blue against the muted gold. He bent and pulled it free, brushing off the grains. The wheels were scuffed but intact, a cheap toy from a dollar bin. Someone had placed it there on purpose, either as a joke or a marker. He slipped it into his pocket without knowing why. The manager came over with a tablet, asked him to sign, reminded him of the 48-hour cleanup rule and the ban on dumping. She suggested contractor bags or a guy with a truck, smiling without much conviction. Ethan nodded, thanked her, and walked back to his car more slowly than he had arrived. On the drive home, two voices argued in his head. One called him an idiot for buying a problem he couldn't afford to solve. The other pointed out he had spent more than that on pizza last month when he was too tired to cook. $20 for a story, the second voice said, was better than $20 for another invisible bill. Behind them both lingered a quieter question. What kind of person went to this much trouble just to bury sand? He picked Lily up, listened to her talk about school and a picture she had drawn, and decided not to say anything yet. That night, after she fell asleep with the light on and a book open on her chest, Ethan sat at the small kitchen table, turning the plastic toy truck over in his fingers and looking at the red key on the napkin beside his mug. If he cleared the sand and found nothing, it would hurt and it would be embarrassing, but their life would go on as it had. If there was something hidden, even a few tools or collectibles, it could mean shelves instead of milk crates, a few months without choosing which bill to pay late. The risk began to feel smaller than the weight of standing still. The next morning, with Lily occupied at the neighbor's table by pancakes and a puzzle, Ethan returned to Westline with a borrowed shovel, 3 heavy tarps, and more nerves than he wanted to admit. The lot was nearly empty now, the weekend crowd gone, the distant hum of traffic and the clatter of a cart somewhere down the row, the only sounds. He parked, walked to B12, and paused beneath the pale ceiling sky. "All right," he murmured to no one. "Let's see what you were hiding." He unlocked the red door and lifted it slowly. The sand waited, dull gold under the strip lights, unmoving. Ethan stepped inside, feeling the fine grit shift under his boots, and drove the shovel into the front edge with a hard thrust. The shovel sank into the sand with a dull resistance that surprised Ethan. He had expected it to slide easily, the way beach sand did when you scooped it with your hands as a child, but this was different. The blade cut in only a few inches before stopping, as if it had struck something solid, and he had to put his weight into it. Boots braced against the concrete floor, arms tightening as he forced the metal down and pulled back. The sand came up heavy and compacted, clinging together in a dense mass that broke apart only after a sharp shake. He dumped the first load onto one of the tarps near the door and stared at the shallow trench he had made. It looked deliberate, shaped, not like something poured carelessly from a truck. He told himself he was overthinking it, that sand left undisturbed long enough would always pack down, but the feeling would not leave him. He worked in slow, measured motions, conscious of his breathing and the strain in his lower back. The air inside the unit grew warmer as he moved, the dust rising in fine clouds that settled on his skin and clothes. After a few minutes, his shoulders began to ache, and sweat trickled down his spine despite the cool hum of the storage facility. He paused, leaning on the shovel handle, and listened. The building was quiet, almost reverent, as if it were holding its breath along with him. Somewhere far away, a cart rattled briefly and then stopped. He realized how alone he was and felt a flicker of unease, the sense that he had stepped into something without fully understanding it. He reminded himself why he was there. $20 had already been spent. If there was nothing, then there was nothing, but at least he would know. He shoved the shovel in again and pulled up another load. The second and third scoops confirmed what he had begun to suspect. The sand was layered. Near the surface it was lighter and slightly looser, but just beneath that it darkened and stiffened, as if it had been poured wet and allowed to settle before more was added on top. Someone had not simply dumped it here. Someone had worked. The thought made his pulse quicken. As he dug, small objects began to appear, half buried and easy to miss if he had been careless. A faded plastic bucket emerged near the wall, cracked along one side, the kind sold with cheap beach toys. Inside it were a few smooth stones, rounded and pale, each one washed clean of grit. He lifted them out and set them aside, puzzled. They looked collected, chosen, not random debris swept up with the sand. A few feet farther back, his shovel struck something with a hollow tap. He froze, heart leaping, then crouched and brushed the sand away with his hands. It was only an old coffee mug, chipped but intact, buried upright as if placed there carefully. He turned it over and saw a name scratched faintly into the bottom, the letters worn down almost to nothing. He could not make them out. By the time his arms were burning and his shirt clung damply to his back, he had uncovered several more small items. A bundle of yellowed newspapers wrapped in twine, their dates spanning years. A pair of worn work gloves folded together. And near the front edge of the unit, Close to where he had first driven in the shovel, the same toy truck he had noticed the day before lay half exposed, its blue plastic dulled by sand. He picked it up again, heavier now with grit packed into its seams, and a strange tightness formed in his chest. These were not the remains of a careless life. They were markers, placed with intention. He sat back on his heels, letting the shovel fall with a clatter, and wiped his face with the back of his hand. If this had been a prank, it was an elaborate one. If it had been an attempt to hide something, then the sand was only the first barrier. He thought of Lily in the neighbor's kitchen, of the pancakes and laughter he had left behind, and felt a brief pang of guilt. He could leave now. Lock the door, call it a loss, and try to sell whatever he had found for a few dollars. The rational part of him urged exactly that. But another part, the same one that had raised his hand at the auction, whispered that stopping now would be worse than failing. He dug again, this time with renewed focus. He decided to work in a straight line toward the back wall, creating a narrow trench rather than clearing the whole unit. It was slower, more controlled, and it made sense to him in a way the chaotic scooping did not. He spread the tarps carefully to keep the sand contained, stacking the removed material in neat piles. The discipline of the task calmed him. Each shovelful was an answer to the question of whether he had imagined the order in the sand. The deeper he went, the clearer it became that the layers continued, consistent and purposeful. An hour passed, then another. His hands blistered, his arms trembled when he paused too long, and the muscles in his back sent sharp warnings with every twist. Still he kept going, driven by a growing certainty that he was close to something that mattered. Then, just as fatigue threatened to dull his attention, the sound changed. The shovel struck something solid with a flat metallic thud that rang differently from the scrape of concrete. Ethan jerked the tool back as if stung and stood frozen, listening to his own breathing echo in the small space. He waited, half expecting an alarm to sound or a voice to call out, but nothing happened. Slowly, carefully, he knelt and brushed the sand away with his fingers. A corner of metal emerged, dark and rusted, its edge straight and unmistakably manufactured. It was not part of the building. He cleared more sand, uncovering a small rectangular shape set flush into the packed layers, as if it had been laid down and buried on purpose. His heart hammered as he worked around it, exposing a metal box no bigger than a shoebox, its surface scarred and corroded, a simple latch holding it shut. He sat back and stared at it, his mind racing ahead to possibilities he tried to rein in. He told himself to breathe. He told himself not to imagine too much. He lifted the box with both hands and was surprised by its weight. Whatever was inside was dense, solid. He carried it carefully to the entrance of the unit and set it on the tarp, then stared at the latch as if it might bite him. A part of him wanted to put it back and pretend he had never seen it. Another part, stronger now, reached for the screwdriver he had brought along for prying nails and tightening loose handles. The latch resisted for a moment, then snapped open with a sharp crack that made him flinch. Inside, neatly arranged, were stacks of paper wrapped in rubber bands, the edges of the bills yellowed but unmistakable. Beneath them lay several small velvet pouches and a collection of coins sealed in clear plastic sleeves, each labeled with careful handwriting. Ethan's throat went dry. He did not touch anything at first. He simply looked, his mind struggling to catch up with the reality in front of him. This was not the fortune of the videos, not the cinematic treasure chest people dreamed of, but it was real, tangible, and far more than he had expected to find. A rush of emotions surged through him, sharp and conflicting. Relief, fear, disbelief, and a creeping sense of guilt all tangled together until he could not separate them. He thought of Lily's shoes with the worn soles, of the overdue notices, of the way his chest tightened every time the phone rang. Then he thought of the person who had buried this box under layers of sand and wondered why. He closed the lid gently, as if the contents were fragile, and sat on the edge of the unit, staring out at the empty lot. The discovery did not end his questions. It multiplied them. If someone had gone to this much trouble to hide a single box, what else lay beneath the sand? He looked back at the trench he had dug and noticed, for the first time, the faint impressions along the packed surface farther back. Parallel lines that suggested wheels or a sled dragged across the floor. The sand there was smoother, more compacted, as if it had been compressed by weight. His pulse quickened again. This was not the end. It was a beginning. He locked the red door and carried the metal box to his car, hiding it beneath an old blanket in the trunk. The drive home felt unreal, the world outside the windshield too bright and ordinary for what he carried with him. At home, he waited until Lily was absorbed in her homework before setting the box on the kitchen table. He did not open it again. He simply placed his hands on either side of it and closed his eyes. Whatever this was, it was more than luck. It was someone else's story intersecting with his, and he could feel the weight of that connection settling over him like the sand he had just begun to clear. That night, sleep came in fragments. He dreamed of digging endlessly, of layers that never ended, of a red door closing behind him no matter how fast he moved. When morning came, he woke with sore muscles and a single, clear decision. He would go back. He would dig deeper, carefully, deliberately, until he understood what he had bought. The sand was not random, and he could no longer pretend otherwise. Ethan returned to Westline Storage early the next morning with his body still aching from the day before, and his mind running faster than his muscles could keep up with. The decision he had made during the night felt heavier now that he was acting on it, as if choosing to dig deeper had shifted something permanent inside him. He parked in the same spot, carried his tools back to the red door, and unlocked it with a familiarity that unsettled him. The sand greeted him in silence, unchanged except for the narrow trench he had carved through it. It looked almost offended by his intrusion, the smooth surface broken and uneven where he had been. He stepped inside, rolled up his sleeves, and began again, this time with purpose rather than curiosity. Instead of clearing wide areas, he focused on extending the trench straight toward the back wall, working methodically as if this were a job he had been hired to do rather than a mystery he had stumbled into. Each shovel of sand came up dense and heavy, and each load confirmed the same thing he had already learned. The layers were intentional. The deeper he went, the more consistent they became, as if someone had measured time by how much sand they could lay down before stopping. Sweat dripped from his chin, his hands stung from raw blisters, but the rhythm of the work carried him forward. He was no longer chasing the thrill of discovery. He was following a path someone else had laid out for him. As the trench deepened, more objects appeared along the way, each one making the space feel less like a storage unit and more like the remains of a carefully dismantled life. He uncovered a plastic container filled with children's beach toys, bright and faded at the same time, rinsed clean and stacked neatly. Nearby, a cardboard box held kitchen items wrapped individually in newspaper. A chipped plate, a single fork, a cracked salt shaker. Farther along, his shovel scraped against a small metal canister packed with foam, empty but preserved, as if it had once held something delicate. None of it made sense as trash. It felt curated, like exhibits laid out along a timeline he could not yet read. He was bent over, prying loose a bundle of cloth from the sand, when he heard footsteps echo faintly in the corridor behind him. His first instinct was panic. He straightened too quickly, pain flaring in his back, and turned toward the sound. A woman stood a few units down, hands on her hips, squinting toward him with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. It was Paula, the manager he had spoken to briefly during the auction, her hair pulled back and her name badge catching the light. "You're really doing it," she said, walking closer. "Most people give up after 10 minutes. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans, suddenly self-conscious. "I figured I already paid for it," he said. "Might as well see it through." She laughed softly and leaned against the wall, peering into the unit. "Looks like a beach in there," she said, then frowned slightly. "Though, not the messiest one I've seen." He hesitated, then decided there was no point pretending. "It's packed," he said, "like someone wanted it that way." Paula nodded slowly. "That tracks," she said. "Guy who rented it was particular. Always paid cash. Never late, never early either. Showed up after hours usually. Quiet, kept to himself." "Did he ever say what he was storing?" Ethan asked. She shook her head. "Nope, and I didn't ask. We don't ask questions unless we have to." She glanced down the corridor, lowering her voice. "Cameras caught him one night bringing in a small truck. Couldn't see much once he got past the office. Blind spot down here. By the time we noticed he'd stopped paying, he was already gone. Gone where? Ethan asked. Paula shrugged. That's the thing. No forwarding address, no phone that worked. Just gone. She paused, studying the sand again. You find anything interesting yet? Ethan thought of the metal box in his trunk and chose his words carefully. Just old stuff, he said. Nothing dangerous. She nodded, accepting the answer without pushing. Be careful, she said. Sand shifts. Don't get yourself hurt in there. Then she smiled, softer this time. I'll grab you another shovel from the office. 2 hands go faster than one. When she left, Ethan stood alone again, her words echoing in his head. Gone. No forwarding address. The idea unsettled him more than he expected. He returned to his work with renewed focus, the trench now wide enough for him to stand comfortably. As he cleared more sand near the back wall, the sound beneath his shovel changed again, broader and flatter than before. This time it was unmistakable. He scraped away the top layer and froze. A smooth, square outline emerged from the packed sand, darker than the surrounding concrete. He dropped to his knees and brushed it clean, revealing a metal plate set flush into the floor. The edges were precise, the corners sharp. This was no buried box. This was a hatch. Ethan sat back on his heels, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The presence of the hatch changed everything. It meant planning, construction, forethought. Someone had not simply hidden valuables here. They had built a space to protect them. He stood and paced the length of the unit once, forcing himself to slow down. He did not open it right away. Instead, he swept more sand aside, clearing the area around the square until the full outline was visible. In one corner, a recessed handle waited, its edges worn smooth from use. He locked the unit and went home without touching it. The decision surprised even him, but the weight of what he had found demanded caution. That evening, he helped Lily with her homework, cooked dinner, and listened to her talk about a science project as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The normalcy steadied him. When she was asleep, he sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the ceiling, replaying the image of the hatch over and over, until he knew there would be no peace until it was open. The next morning he returned with a pry bar and a length of sturdy wood he had borrowed from a neighbor's shed. He cleared the remaining sand from the hatch, wiped his palms on his jeans, and gripped the recessed handle. It did not move. He wedged the pry bar into the gap and applied pressure slowly, carefully, listening for any sign of cracking or collapse. The metal resisted, then shifted with a groan that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet unit. A rush of cold air spilled up from beneath the floor, carrying with it the dry, metallic smell of long-sealed space. Ethan stepped back and waited, his instincts screaming warnings he tried to respect. When nothing happened, he leaned forward and pulled. The hatch opened just enough to reveal darkness below. He braced the wooden beam under the edge and lifted again, inch by inch, until the square plate rested open, exposing a shallow concrete chamber beneath the floor. It was not a tunnel or a room in the way he had half expected. It was a reinforced cavity, carefully poured and lined, just large enough to hold what someone valued most. He shone his flashlight inside and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. 3 objects sat within the chamber, arranged neatly and secured against movement. A heavy steel safe, scratched and worn, a large plastic container wrapped in layers of clear film and tape, and a canvas duffel bag, its zipper pulled tight, the fabric stiff with age. Ethan did not climb down. He knelt at the edge and stared, the reality of it sinking in. This was not luck. This was design. He reached in and tested the weight of the duffel, surprised by how solid it felt, then carefully lifted it out and set it on the concrete floor above. One by one, he removed the container and the safe, grunting with effort as he hauled them up. When the chamber was empty, he closed the hatch and sat on the floor, his back against the wall, breathing hard. For a long time, he did nothing but look at the 3 objects lined up in front of him. The duffel, the container, the safe. They felt like doors in their own right, each one leading deeper into a life he did not yet understand. The sand, the hatch, the careful placement all pointed to the same conclusion. This was not about hiding from the law or burying stolen goods. This was about preservation, about control, about someone who had learned painfully that the world did not keep what you cared about unless you did it yourself. Ethan ran a hand over his face and closed his eyes. He had crossed another line, one he could not step back over. Whatever waited inside those containers would answer questions he was no longer able to ignore. He gathered his strength, reached for the duffel, and prepared to open the first door beneath the concrete. Ethan began with the canvas duffel bag, not because it seemed the most important, but because it felt the most human. The fabric was worn soft, the color faded unevenly, as if it had been handled often and then set aside for years. He pulled the zipper slowly, half expecting it to jam, but it slid open with a dry rasp. Inside, everything was packed with care. On top lay a folded flannel shirt, clean, neatly pressed, smelling faintly of old detergent and dust. Beneath it were work gloves, stiff but intact, and a pair of heavy boots wrapped in plastic, soles barely worn. They were the kinds of things a man kept ready not for travel, but for return, as if he believed he would come back and need to put them on again. Below the clothing were several small metal tins, the kind that once held cookies or sewing supplies. Ethan opened the first and found coins, dozens of them, wrapped in tissue and stacked edge to edge. They were not ancient treasures, not pirate gold or museum pieces, but they were old, foreign, and carefully sorted. The second tin held more coins, different countries, different eras. The third contained a mixture of small personal items, a simple wristwatch with a cracked face, a bent key with no label, and a thin chain with a tiny charm shaped like a star. Ethan closed the tins and set them aside, his unease growing. These were not random valuables. They were keepsakes disguised as currency. At the bottom of the bag, he found envelopes. Each was thick, stuffed with cash, and marked with a single word and a date written in careful, uneven handwriting. Roof, truck, dentist, winter. The last envelope was different. It was marked with a name, a boy's name. Ethan's chest tightened as he held it. He did not open that one yet. Instead, he moved on to the plastic container, needing distance from the sudden weight of what he had touched. The container was sealed tightly, layer upon layer of tape resisting his fingers. When he finally cut through and lifted the lid, he found documents, folders arranged by year, and notebooks filled with cramped writing. Receipts, pay stubs, medical bills, insurance forms, all meticulously saved. At first glance, they looked boring, the paper trail of an ordinary life. But as he flipped through them, a pattern emerged. Early years showed small amounts, low wages, frequent overdraft notices. Then came medical invoices, growing larger, more frequent, marked unpaid or delayed, insurance denials, appeals, notes scribbled in the margins. Then abruptly a gap. Fewer medical documents, more work records, overtime hours, 2 jobs overlapping, a third added on weekends. The numbers climbed slowly, painfully, year by year. Ethan sat back, the pieces beginning to align. He opened one of the notebooks, careful not to tear the fragile pages. At first it was nothing more than lists and calculations, expenses, savings goals, hours worked. But midway through, the tone changed. Short sentences appeared between the numbers, reminders not to trust credit, notes about keeping cash, warnings written to himself about delays, about systems failing when time mattered most. And then, several pages in, he found the entry that stopped him cold. It was dated many years ago, written shakily, the ink darker in places where the pen had pressed too hard. It spoke of a hospital room, of machines that beeped and hummed, of a boy too small for the bed he lay in. It did not name the illness in detail, only referred to it as something that could be fixed, maybe if they acted fast enough. The words circled around money again and again. Deposits, estimates, a procedure that could not wait, a choice that should never exist. The entry ended abruptly, the last line trailing off, unfinished. Ethan closed the notebook and stared at the wall. He did not need the rest spelled out to understand. The man who had built this hidden chamber had once been powerless. Not reckless, not irresponsible, just poor at the worst possible moment. Poor when time was short and the price of delay was measured in a child's breath. Ethan felt a pressure behind his eyes and welcomed the distraction of movement as he stood and paced the length of the unit. When he returned, he opened the envelope with the boy's name. Inside were a few photographs, edges worn smooth. A child standing in front of a school building, smiling awkwardly. A birthday cake with too many candles. A hospital bracelet folded carefully and kept dry. No money, just proof. Ethan put the photos back and sealed the envelope again, his hands trembling slightly. The steel safe waited last, solid and impersonal. He circled it once, then twice, as if expecting it to reveal something on its own. There was no key, no obvious code written on the outside. But when he tilted it to check the underside, he noticed faint scratches near one of the feet. 3 numbers, carved lightly into the metal, almost invisible unless you knew to look. He dialed them in without thinking, his fingers moving on instinct. The lock clicked open with a sound that echoed louder than it should have. Inside the safe were more documents and a single letter sealed in a plain envelope. Ethan removed it carefully, reading the first lines while still standing, then slowly lowering himself to the floor as the meaning settled into him. The letter was written by the man who had rented the unit, addressed not to a specific person, but to whoever found this place and was willing to dig. It spoke plainly of a life defined by one moment, of a son who had died not because he could not be saved, but because the saving had been out of reach. It described the years that followed, years spent working not for comfort or pleasure, but to erase the feeling of helplessness that had consumed him. He wrote of money not as wealth, but as time, as options, as the difference between acting and watching. The letter explained the sand, the layers, the hiding. He did not trust banks, not after being told to wait while a clock counted down somewhere else. He trusted weight, depth, effort. He trusted that anyone who found this place and chose to keep going would understand the cost of stopping too soon. He wrote that he had no family left, no one to leave this to directly. He asked only one thing of the person who uncovered it. Use it better than he had, not faster, not greedier, but sooner, while it could still matter. Ethan read the letter twice, then a third time, until the words blurred. He thought of Lily, of the way her hand fit into his, of the quiet terror he carried every time she coughed too long or ran a fever. He thought of the choices he had almost had to make. The letter was not a gift. It was a burden passed carefully, deliberately, from one broken father to another who still had time. When he finally stood, the unit felt different, less like a lucky find and more like a responsibility that had been waiting. Ethan packed the documents and the letter back into the safe, locked it, and loaded everything into his car. He did not feel triumphant. He felt watched, not by a person, but by a memory, by a man who had done everything too late and had built this place so that someone else might not have to. As he drove home, the weight of what he had learned pressed down on him harder than any shovel of sand ever could. The story was no longer a mystery. It was a warning. And as the red door of Unit B12 disappeared in his rearview mirror, Ethan understood that the next decisions he made would define not just what he found, but who he chose to be. The days that followed passed in a strange, muted rhythm, as if Ethan were moving through his own life slightly out of sync with the rest of the world. The knowledge he carried from the storage unit settled into him slowly, not as shock but as pressure, a steady presence that colored every small moment. He woke earlier than usual, lay awake longer at night, and found himself watching Lily with a quiet intensity that startled him. The letter's words echoed whenever he packed her lunch, whenever he checked the weather before walking her to school, whenever he hesitated at the grocery store over prices he had memorized by heart. Use it sooner, while it could still matter. He returned to Westline Storage only once more that week, not to dig but to clean. The sand was hauled out methodically, loaded into contractor bags and disposed of as Paula had instructed. She watched him from the doorway for a while, arms crossed, saying nothing, her expression unreadable. When the unit was finally empty, the concrete floor bare and ordinary again, the space felt smaller, almost disappointing, as if its secret had been the only thing giving it shape. Ethan signed the final paperwork, paid for the extra days, and locked the door for the last time. B12 became just another unit again, indistinguishable from the rest. Whatever had happened there now lived entirely with him. At home, the safe and the containers occupied a corner of his bedroom closet, hidden behind winter coats and old boxes. He did not open them again right away. Instead, he gathered documents, receipts, and the letter, spreading them across the kitchen table late at night when Lily was asleep. He began to make lists, not of what he could buy, but of what needed to be settled. Overdue bills, old medical debt, repairs he had postponed too long. Each number he wrote down was familiar, yet the knowledge that he could now face them without fear felt unreal, like testing a limb after it has been numb. Still, doubt crept in. He questioned whether taking any of it was right, whether honoring the letter meant giving it all away, or whether the man who wrote it had intended something more balanced. The words were simple, but their meaning was not. Use it better than I did. Ethan read the letter again and again, searching for permission or condemnation, and finding neither. It offered no instructions beyond the responsibility itself. The answer came not in a dramatic moment, but during an ordinary afternoon. Lily came home from school quieter than usual, her shoulders slumped, her backpack dragging against the floor. When Ethan asked what was wrong, she hesitated before explaining that a classmate had been sick for weeks and now wasn't coming back. The girl's parents couldn't afford the treatments anymore, and everyone knew it, even if no one said it out loud. Lily asked the question without fully understanding it, the way children do. Why does money decide things like that? Ethan had no answer that would make sense. He hugged her, felt the familiar fear rise in his chest, and in that moment the choice clarified itself. The money was not a miracle or a prize. It was insulation against helplessness. It was time bought back. That night after Lily went to bed, Ethan unlocked the safe again and took inventory carefully, recording everything with the same meticulous care the previous owner had shown. He researched, consulted quietly, and confirmed what was legal, what was not, and what would require time. He started with the bank. Walking into the branch felt more intimidating than the auction ever had. He did not announce what he had found or dramatize his story. He simply explained that he had information related to a deceased client's safety deposit box and assets, and that he wanted to make sure everything was handled correctly. The process was slow, bureaucratic, and exhausting, but it was honest. When the manager confirmed that part of the contents would be claimed as unclaimed property without heirs, Ethan accepted it without argument. Some things he understood were not his to keep. What remained was still enough to change his life, enough to erase the constant threat of collapse that had followed him for years. He paid his debts quietly, methodically, watching balances drop to zero one by one. Each confirmation email felt surreal. He repaired the car instead of replacing it immediately. He fixed the refrigerator. He opened a savings account in Lily's name, labeling it simply for the future, without specifics, because imagining too far ahead still felt dangerous. Only after the essentials were secured did he turn to the rest. He set aside a portion of the money deliberately, not impulsively, and contacted organizations that help families facing medical crises. He did not give anonymously, but he did not seek recognition either. He explained where the money came from in the simplest terms possible and made one request, that it be used to shorten waiting times, to cover gaps, to make sure no one was told to wait when waiting could not be afforded. Weeks passed. Life did not transform overnight into something glossy or perfect. Ethan still worked, he still worried, but the background noise of fear faded, replaced by something steadier. He slept better. He laughed more easily. Lily noticed the change before he did, commenting one morning that he didn't look tired anymore. He smiled at that, knowing how fragile the truth behind it still was. One evening, as they drove past the storage facility on their way home, Lily pointed at the rows of doors and asked if that was the place with the sand. Ethan nodded, telling her a gentler version of the story, one about working hard and finding something unexpected, about helping others when you can. She listened, thoughtful, then said she was glad he didn't give up when it looked stupid. Her words landed with surprising force. That night, Ethan took the letter out one last time and read it slowly, carefully, as if responding to it in his own mind. He understood now that the man who had written it was not asking for absolution or gratitude. He was asking for continuation, for proof that his years of effort, even if too late for his own child, could still ripple outward and matter. Ethan folded the letter and placed it back in the safe, not as a reminder of guilt, but as a marker of resolve. The weight he carried had shifted. It was no longer the burden of choice alone, but the responsibility of having chosen. And as he turned off the light and listened to the quiet breathing of his daughter down the hall, he knew that the hardest part was not finding what was hidden beneath the sand, but deciding what kind of man he would be once it was uncovered. The changes in Ethan's life did not arrive with celebration or announcement. They unfolded quietly, like a house settling after a long storm. Small shifts in pressure that made the structure safer without altering its outward shape. He kept working, but he no longer accepted every job out of fear. He chose them. That alone felt like a radical act. He turned down the worst-paying shifts, the ones that left him exhausted and short-tempered, and replaced them with steadier work he could plan around Lily's school schedule. The panic that had once lived in his chest, constant and sharp, dulled into something manageable, a memory rather than a threat. With time came reflection. Ethan began to understand that what the man in B12 had truly left behind was not money, but a record of a life shaped by one irreversible moment. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that the hidden chamber had been less a vault and more a confession. Every layer of sand, every carefully packed object, every note written in cramped handwriting had been an attempt to impose order on a world that had once demanded too much too quickly. Ethan felt that weight now, not as grief, but as instruction. He started a small business almost without realizing it. What began as helping a neighbor clear out a garage turned into paid work, then into recommendations. Ethan discovered that he was good at it, not just the physical labor, but the patience it required. People trusted him with the remnants of their lives, with boxes they had avoided opening for years. He handled their belongings carefully, asking questions when it mattered and staying silent when it didn't. Word spread. He did not advertise loudly. He did not need to. His reputation grew from the same quiet consistency that had once kept him afloat when everything else failed. Lily adjusted to the changes faster than he did. Children, Ethan learned, sensed stability long before adults trusted it. She slept better. She laughed more easily. She stopped asking questions about money that no 9-year-old should have learned to ask. One afternoon, she asked if they could plan a weekend trip somewhere nearby. Not far, just somewhere with trees and water. The request caught Ethan off guard. Planning ahead had always felt dangerous, like tempting fate. But he agreed, and when the day came, nothing went wrong. They drove, they walked, they ate sandwiches by the lake. It was ordinary and perfect in a way he had almost forgotten was possible. The letter stayed with him. He did not reread it often, but he carried its message into places it was never meant to go. When a client hesitated over costs, embarrassed to admit they were struggling, Ethan adjusted without comment. When he learned that a local family was quietly fundraising for a child's treatment, he contributed through the same channels he had before, careful to remain unseen. He did not feel like a savior. He felt like a relay runner, carrying something forward because stopping would mean dropping it. There were moments of doubt. Late at night, when the house was quiet and Lily was asleep, Ethan sometimes wondered whether he had done enough, whether the man who had lost his son would have approved of the balance he struck between keeping and giving. He wondered whether he had misunderstood the letter, whether true honor would have meant giving everything away. Those thoughts never fully disappeared, but neither did the understanding that his first responsibility was to the child who still needed him. The difference between guilt and responsibility became clearer with time. He visited the bank occasionally, not out of necessity, but out of habit, checking accounts, asking questions, making sure nothing had shifted without his notice. The manager recognized him now, greeted him warmly, asked about Lily by name. These small acknowledgments grounded him. They reminded him that transparency was not the enemy, that systems could be navigated rather than feared if approached carefully and early enough. One afternoon, nearly a year after the auction, Ethan drove past Westline Storage again, alone this time. The rows of doors looked exactly as they always had, neutral and anonymous. He parked briefly and walked along the corridor where B12 had once stood out in faded red. The door was blue now, freshly painted, rented to someone else. There was no trace of sand, no hint of what had been buried beneath the concrete. The place felt smaller than it had in his memory. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary, then turned and left without regret. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Ethan opened the safe once more. Most of it was empty now, its contents redistributed into the world where they could do something useful. At the bottom lay the letter, folded carefully, edges soft from handling. He held it for a long moment, then placed it in a drawer in his desk, where he kept important documents and things he wanted to remember. It no longer needed to be locked away. Its work was done, or at least ongoing through him. As he turned off the light and headed to bed, Ethan realized that the most profound change was not financial at all. It was the absence of that old gnawing sense that he was always one step away from disaster. In its place was something quieter and stronger, a belief that effort mattered, that showing up mattered, that sometimes digging into what others avoided did not uncover danger, but responsibility, waiting patiently for someone willing to accept it. Time did what it always did best. It softened the sharp edges without erasing their shape. Years passed, not marked by dramatic milestones, but by the steady accumulation of ordinary days that no longer carried the weight of fear. Ethan's life settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than borrowed. Mornings began with coffee and quiet, evenings with shared meals and conversations that wandered from school projects to small dreams that no longer felt irresponsible to voice. The apartment grew less temporary, filled with furniture chosen carefully, not out of desperation, but intention. It was not luxury. It was stability, and that was more than Ethan had once believed possible. Lily grew, slowly at first and then all at once, the way children do. She learned to ride a bike, outgrew clothes faster than he could keep track of, and began to understand the world in ways that both amazed and frightened him. She asked harder questions now, not just about money, but about fairness, about why some people had to fight harder than others just to stand still. Ethan answered honestly when he could, and admitted ignorance when he couldn't. What mattered most was that these questions were no longer asked from a place of fear. They were asked from curiosity, from the assumption that the future existed and could be planned for. The small business grew steadily, never exploding into something flashy, but expanding enough to support them comfortably. Ethan hired help when he needed it, paid fairly, and treated the work with the same respect he treated people's stories. He became known as someone who could be trusted with more than boxes and debris. He was trusted with endings. When families needed help sorting through the remains of loved ones, Ethan approached the work with care, setting aside photographs and letters, returning items that clearly mattered. He never spoke about B12, never framed himself as someone who had been lucky. Luck implied randomness. What he had experienced felt more deliberate than that. The donations continued quietly, regular and unannounced. Ethan never watched for results or asked for recognition. He trusted the process the way the man before him had trusted sand and concrete, not because it was perfect, but because it was something he could control. Occasionally, he received a brief letter or email from an organization, a simple thank you, a note about a child who had received treatment in time. He read these messages once, sometimes twice, then filed them away. They were not trophies. They were confirmations that the choice he had made continued to ripple outward, unseen but real. On the anniversary of the auction, without consciously planning it, Ethan found himself driving past Westline Storage again. Lily sat beside him, older now, headphones around her neck, watching the world pass by with the detached interest of someone on the edge of adolescence. The building looked unchanged, anonymous rows of doors reflecting the afternoon light. Lily pointed, recognizing it immediately, and smiled. "That's where the sand was," she said, not as a question, but a memory. Ethan nodded. "That's where things changed," he replied. She considered this, then shrugged in the way children do when they accept something without needing to dismantle it. "I'm glad you didn't stop," she said simply. They drove on, the storage facility shrinking behind them until it disappeared completely. Ethan felt no pull to return, no need to mark the place. Its purpose in his life was finished. What remained had moved with him, absorbed into habits, choices, and the quiet confidence that replaced the constant tension he once carried. The red door, the sand, the hidden chamber had become symbols rather than destinations. That night, after Lily went to bed, Ethan opened the desk drawer where he kept the letter. He unfolded it carefully, the paper worn but intact, the handwriting as uneven and familiar as ever. He read it slowly, not searching for instruction anymore, but acknowledging its presence. The man who had written it was no longer a shadow or a mystery. He was part of Ethan's internal landscape now, a reminder of what happened when time ran out and how much could still be done before it did. Ethan folded the letter and placed it back in the drawer, alongside documents that charted a very different future than the one he once expected. College savings statements, business records, plans that extended years ahead without feeling like temptations. He turned off the light and stood in the quiet, listening to the familiar sounds of his home, the low hum of appliances, the distant traffic, the steady proof that life was continuing, unbroken. In the end, the story of the sand was not about money found or secrets uncovered. It was about the moment someone chose to keep digging when it would have been easier to walk away. It was about understanding that responsibility does not arrive with instructions or applause, only with the opportunity to act. Ethan had accepted that opportunity, not perfectly, not without doubt, but with intention. As he went to bed, Ethan knew that the measure of his life would never be defined by what he had uncovered beneath concrete floors, but by what he chose to build afterward. And in that knowledge, quiet and unremarkable as it was, he found something that felt like peace. A single father, nearly out of money, spends his last dollars on a strange storage unit everyone laughs at. Behind the door there is only sand, but he decides to keep digging. What he finds beneath it changes everything and forces him to make a choice that will shape his future. Watch until the end, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.